Welcome back to This Day. Joining me now from MemorialCare Saddleback Medical Center is Dr. Ashish Shah, cardiac electrophysiologist and cardiologist. Basically, he is the electrician of the heart.
That's right.
So nice to meet you. Thank you for coming on today.
And thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your background. What drew you to become a surgeon?
Cardiology had always intrigued me. Growing up, my dad was involved in nuclear medicine, so they'd do heart scans, and I remember going to the hospital to see him at work and seeing little pictures of the heart. So I always thought it was fascinating. And then as I went through my medical training, I realized this field of electrophysiology is very different and fairly new-ish at that time. And a lot of new technologies and new approaches were evolving at that time within the field, which I found very fascinating. And so I went on to train to be the electrician of the heart.
Wow, yeah. That's incredible. And just a little background about you.
Yeah.
You said your wife is a lawyer.
Yeah, my wife's an attorney.
You have 3 children.
Yeah, we got 3 kids, which are keeping us busy as always, bussing them around. We're both originally from Illinois, and then we both did our graduate studies out there, college out there. We met at the University of Illinois, and then we moved out to the East Coast where I did all my cardiac training. At multiple hospitals there, and I came out here about 5.5 years ago.
Okay, wow. We are very blessed to have you for sure. And so today's topic is atrial fibrillation, AFib. Tell me what is this?
So AFib is the most common abnormal rhythm of the heart. The term arrhythmia just means abnormal rhythm, so it's the most common arrhythmia that we see. There's a direct correlation to aging with this, which is why our community is, significantly impacted by this disorder, or I call it a disease, because it's very complicated. But in its simplicity, to put it simply, it's a rhythm that makes the atrium, which are the upper chambers, quiver. They go so fast they cannot actually squeeze properly, and they just quiver and shake. In that process, it makes your heart rate or your pulse also go up. So you can have your heart racing 160 beats a minute for no good reason.
Wow.
And that can make people feel very uncomfortable. But the other side of it is because the atrium are not squeezing properly and they're just quivering, that can create blood that becomes stagnant and creates blood clots. Those clots break off. They typically can go to the brain, causing strokes, which is why we correlate strokes with AFib. But in theory, they could bypass the great vessels that go to the brain, and that blood clot could go anywhere in the body.
Okay. And so what are the symptoms that someone may be experiencing if they're having this?
Sure, yeah. So the most common symptom is someone feeling the sensation of the heart racing. Now, for different people, that feels differently. It could feel like a flutter in the chest or maybe extra heartbeats in the throat area. So everyone's a little different how that feels. But if it goes on, people will feel maybe some chest discomfort, lightheadedness, shortness of breath. Certainly fatigue is a very common symptom. But the most alarming thing about this is that the majority of people will not have any symptoms from this disorder. They'll say, oh yeah, I don't feel it at all. Or people may only feel it when it makes the heart race, but it can also not make the heart race, and then you don't even notice it's there.
Wow. And so if you have this and say you are doing some type of activity that makes the heart race, would it feel different than normally? That's
a good question. So it really comes down to that time. What I mean by that is, are they actually in AFib in that moment, or are they in normal rhythm at that moment? So for example, people can have AFib that comes and goes, maybe once a month or once a year even, or they can be in it 24/7. So let's just take the example that someone's stuck in the atrial fibrillation and they're going for a brisk walk, for example. It's not uncommon for the heart to race significantly more because of the way our heart conducts and is stimulated by adrenaline. Our pulse will potentially go even faster. Now, whether that'll create symptoms or not, it's hard to say depending upon what the person is doing and how they tolerate their racing heart. Some people, like I said, can be 150 beats a minute and not even feel a thing. They'll say, oh, I feel fine. I can promise you, though, those people, if they stay that way for a number of days or weeks, they'll end up in the emergency room.
Okay, interesting. And so what are the potential health risks if nothing is done about it?
Great question. So we talked about blood clots, and that clot can go anywhere in the body, but the most significant one is the correlation to strokes. So that's the biggest one that we're worried about. But if a heart rate goes unchecked and the AFib goes unchecked, you can develop heart attacks, you can develop heart failure, which is where your heart pump is not squeezing as strong as it should, and that in turn can lead to other complications with your health.
Wow. And so what are some of the treatment options to do for this?
So there's always the conversation I have with my patients of whether you do nothing because you feel fine, or you do something because you feel something, or the risks for other things down the road. Treatments include, medicines that can slow down the heart rate. They can include medicines that help keep you out of atrial fibrillation as well. In addition to that, there's catheter ablation, which I do, and I perform to help treat atrial fibrillation and minimize it without the need of medications long term, as well as the Watchman procedure we do to help people have stroke protection in the individuals that cannot tolerate or cannot afford blood thinners.
Okay. Wow. And so I should have asked first, how do you find out that this is actually, what is going on with the heart?
Great question. So it usually starts with a symptom, honestly. Someone will say, I just don't feel right, something's off. Many times in the hospital setting is different than the office setting. In the hospital setting, they may come in with a pneumonia and they get an EKG, and the EKG shows AFib. So that's a new diagnosis to them in that moment in the setting of a pneumonia. However, in the office setting, usually someone says, I'm feeling something. I feel winded really easily, my heart races unusually, I get periodic lightheadedness and fatigue. So with that then comes a workup. That workup usually includes an ultrasound of the heart called an echocardiogram to look at the heart structure in more detail. It may or may not include a stress test, and it certainly includes heart monitors to help look for abnormal rhythms, including atrial fibrillation.
Okay, and then is there anything that we can do to prevent or at least try to slow it down?
Yeah, great question. So what we were discussing earlier was the fact that I call AFib a disease or a disorder. It's not just a rhythm problem. So what I mean by that is the atrial fibrillation can be a direct rise from something cardiac in origin or from the heart itself, or it can be secondary to something else. For example, let's take someone who has severe sepsis and infection. They could go into AFib. They may have never had it before in their life, but in that setting, they develop AFib. Those patients may actually not have AFib for life. They may just have it in that setting. Similarly, in people that are post-operative, that have had a surgery and they go into AFib. In other people, the healthy lifestyle is a critical piece to this. So controlling comorbidities like high blood pressure, diabetes, eating right, exercising, getting enough rest, stress management, staying well hydrated, and avoiding excess alcohol are some simple lifestyle things you should focus on to minimize or reduce the risk of developing atrial fibrillation.
Okay, interesting about the alcohol. So that just too frequent drinking or just too much drinking?
So there's been studies that show people that have occasional drinks versus daily drinking versus no drinking at all. And we see a direct correlation to any alcohol consumed. So the people that are sober, have zero alcohol altogether, have the least amount of AFib.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so when you talk about some of the treatments for it, the ablation as opposed to medication, is it usually that you try medication first? Is ablation like a surgery?
That's a great question. So it's always evolved. It's been evolving for a long time. AFib ablation started in around 2000, at the turn of the millennia. And it wasn't that great at that time, wasn't necessarily that safe at that time. Now it's evolved to being a same-day outpatient procedure. It takes about an hour to 2 hours. People are going home a few hours after that. So it's evolved immensely. The success rates are considerably improved. And we talk about reduction of AFib for substantial amounts of time. So therefore, where the ablation plays in the treatment plan is different than before. Before, someone would say, I'll try them on 5, 6 medicines, play with their AFib for 2, 3 years before I refer them for an ablation, because I know that's our last-ditch effort. Nowadays, it's quite the opposite. People that approach ablation sooner in their treatment plan have the best outcomes for life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, that is really good news.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and educating us about this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. If you would like to schedule an appointment with Dr. Shaw, you can contact him at 949-770-6252 or go online to memorialcare.org/heart. Stay with us. We will have more of This Day coming up right up.